Speaker, I'd now like to ask that the House have a moment of silence in remembrance of these good people.
The members will rise and observe a moment of silence. Without objection, 5-minute voting will continue. The unfinished business is the vote on the motion from the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Schuster, to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 3628, on which the yeas and nays were ordered. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 217, H.R. 3628, a bill to eliminate certain unnecessary reporting requirements and consolidate or modify others and for other purposes.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill? Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote.
It's the last recorded vote of the day. Moments ago, Representative Ron Barber of Arizona marked the 3rd anniversary of the shooting of former Representative Gabrielle Giffords in Tucson, Arizona on January the 8th, 2011. Which killed 6 and injured several others, including Ron Barber and including Gabby Giffords. It's also the 50th anniversary today of the War on Poverty. It was on January 8th, 1964, during LBJ's State of the Union address. He declared his unconditional, quote, unconditional war on poverty in America. A number of comments in reaction to the 50th anniversary throughout the day across Capitol Hill, including now live on C-SPAN 2 in the Senate. Tom Harkin is talking about that, and again, you can follow that on C-SPAN 2. The Senate continuing work on the unemployment insurance measure, which would extend unemployment insurance benefits for 3 months through March. A procedural vote is likely later this afternoon on that, and you can follow that on C-SPAN 2. The House has pretty much wrapped up their legislative work for today, but later this week they'll take up a bill dealing with the healthcare.gov website and its security. Also a bill that would expand state responsibility cleaning up the Superfund hazardous waste sites. That's later in the week in the U.S. House.
clerk's vote. The yeas are 406. The nays are 0. 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Washington?
Mr. Speaker, by direction of the House Republican Conference, I send to the desk a privileged resolution and ask for its immediate consideration in the House.
The clerk will report the resolution.
House Resolution 453, resolved that the following named member be and is hereby elected to the following standing committees of the House of Representatives: Committee on Armed Services.
Without objection, the resolution is agreed to, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Purpose as the gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, by direction of the Democratic Caucus, I offer a privileged resolution and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the resolution.
House Resolution 454, resolved that the following named member be and is hereby elected to the following standing committee of the House of Representatives. 1. Committee on Natural Resources, Ms. Clark of Massachusetts.
Without objection, the resolution is agreed to, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The chair lays before the House a communication.
The Honorable the Speaker, House of Representatives, Sir, I hereby tender my resignation from the Commission of the Office of Congressional Ethics. My own advanced age and the health of Mrs. Frenzel and myself are reason enough, but there is also a real need to refresh the Commission on a continuing basis. It has been a pleasure and privilege to serve the House and to work with the Chairman and other members of the Commission and with its staff. I did not need another job, but I was and am convinced that once the OCE has made a positive contribution to the House's ethics processes. I thank you both for your service to the Republic and wish you continued success. Signed, Bill Frenzel.
All right, the chair lays before the House a communication.
The Honorable the Speaker, House of Representatives, Sir, I am serving notice today of my intention to resign from the OCE. It is with great regrets and only because I accepted a position as a member of the Board of Amtrak that I am asking to be relieved. The additional travel to the district for two meetings has become extremely difficult, particularly because of my other responsibilities. I have really enjoyed working with the members of the OCE and the staff. I feel very proud of the accomplishments of the OCE and its positive contribution to the House of Representatives. I have been honored to have had this opportunity to serve. Signed, yours truly, Yvonne B. Burke.
The chair announces the Speaker's appointment pursuant to Section 4D of House Resolution 5, 113th Congress, and the order of the House of January 3, 2013, of the following individuals to serve on the governing board of the Office of Congressional Ethics.
Yep. Nominated by the Speaker with the concurrence of the Minority Leader, Ms. Judy Biggert, Illinois, alternate for the remainder of the term of Mr. Bill Frenzel. Nominated by the Minority Leader with the concurrence of the Speaker, Brigadier General, retired, Belinda Pinckney, Virginia, for the remainder of the term of Mrs. Yvonne Brathwaite Burke.
All right, the chair will now entertain requests for 1-minute speeches. For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to congratulate Eden Prairie wrestling coach Scott Davis on his 1,000th coaching victory as his Eagles squad defeated Columbia Heights by a score of 58-17 last month at Eden Prairie High School. Davis's 1,000th victory gives him the most wins of any high school wrestling coach in the United States. While this is Davis's first year coaching at Eden Prairie, he has coached 35 different seasons at prep wrestling, including 20 years at Owatonna High School, where he coached 2 state championship teams. With a group of his friends attending the match at Eden Prairie, he admitted to feeling a little bit more pressure than usual, but the Eden Prairie team easily delivered the milestone victory. While Coach Davis said he never set a specific goal for victories, he did say that reaching the 1,000th victory was a special accomplishment. So congratulations to Coach Davis for accomplishing this impressive feat, and also thank you for continuing to dedicate yourself to helping student athletes with your time and your talent, and I yield back.
Okay, for what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Speak for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to speak on behalf of thousands of my constituents who have had an essential safety net pulled out from under them because Congress has failed to take action to extend emergency unemployment insurance. On December 28th, 1.3 million nationwide and over 80,000 in my home state of Illinois lost unemployment insurance. Our economy is still recovering from the worst recession since the Great Depression, and now is not the time to cut off this important safety net. I have heard from hundreds of my constituents about this, including Yvonne, a mother of 5 from Aurora, Illinois. And while she has worked all of her life, she is now unemployed. And without unemployment insurance, she will no longer have a car or any of the resources she needs to look for work and to get her career back on track. Unemployment insurance is not a handout, it is a hand up. And for unemployment insurance is for workers who have lost their job through no fault of their own and who need a lifeline while they look for work. In addition to leaving families without a safety net, failing to extend unemployment insurance is simply bad economic policy. Thank you, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Connecticut seek recognition? Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
I rise to voice my objection to the misguided priorities that are taking shape in the conference farm bill. More and more, and despite payment reforms that were included in both the House and Senate legislation, it sounds like this farm bill plans to steal food from the poor to help pay crop subsidies to the rich. Unbelievably, on the 50th anniversary of the war on poverty, it's being reported that the farm bill currently being negotiated in conference will include cuts of roughly $8.5 billion to food stamps, denying critical food aid to over 800,000 households. Some of the same conferees who support these cuts are looking to strip out payment limits that are designed to stop the subsidizing of millionaire and billionaire farmers, a loophole they are reopening that was closed already. They're going to take food from the hungry, children, seniors, veterans, and workers. They're going to go out of their way to ensure that the wealthiest agribusinesses in America are getting handouts, allowing poor Americans to starve so that we can subsidize rich corporations is not why we are here. It is cruel, it is corrupt, it's immoral, and we have to do better for the people that we represent.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Nevada seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, 50 years ago today, President Johnson declared a war on poverty. Since that day, our country has fought to increase access to resources for those struggling to make ends meet. Poverty has declined by more than 1/3 since 1967. That's because historically, we've had strong bipartisan support for programs like Social Security and Medicare, and tax policies like the Earned Income Tax Credit. But the war on poverty is not over. In 2012, there were 49.7 million Americans living in poverty, including 13.4 million of our children. We cannot break our promise to fight poverty. That's why this Congress needs to do everything to strengthen these programs and lift people out of poverty. Tax credits for struggling families reduces the poverty rate in 2012 by 3 points. SNAP helped to reduce poverty by 3 points. And unemployment insurance reduces poverty as well, and it's why we need to extend it. Our commitment to these programs must not waver. Let us work together to really end the war on poverty now.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from New Hampshire seek recognition?
And extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise in strong support for renewing the Emergency Unemployment Compensation Program. Because Congress failed to act, this vital program expired on December 28th of last year. Just 3 days after Christmas, 1.3 million Americans, including over 1,000 Granite Staters, were cut off from their benefits. Each week of congressional inaction, as many as 150 additional Granite Staters will lose access to benefits. This compensation provides a critical lifeline to Granite Staters and other Americans who are struggling to find work. This includes my constituent, Lois Little, a teacher who wrote to me from Colebrook, New Hampshire. At the end of the last school year, Lois lost her job after teaching for 29 years because of falling enrollment in her rural school district. Over the last few months, she has applied to over 100 jobs without any luck. Her savings have been exhausted. Unemployment benefits are now her only source of income, and she is worried about whether she can keep her home. Let's come together and give Lois a chance. Let's renew emergency unemployment compensation today. Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Request permission to address the House, unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute, and advise to extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to recognize the success and legacy of the war on poverty. The war on poverty proposed 50 years ago today in this chamber by then-President and fellow Texan Lyndon Johnson paved the way towards the enactment of many of our nation's most popular and significant federal programs, including Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, Head Start. These programs, along with Social Security, unemployment insurance, and now the Affordable Care Act, form America's social safety net, which has protected millions of our nation's children, working adults, and elderly from falling into poverty. Less than 2 weeks ago, through the inaction of this House, 1.3 million Americans, including 65,000 Texans, saw their unemployment insurance disappear. This number will grow to over 3 million in the coming months if action is not taken. This vital lifeline is essential for millions of our fellow Americans who are out of work and struggling to make ends meet. The 50th anniversary of President Johnson's speech is a perfect opportunity to Congress show its support for these less fortunate, and I call on this chamber to bring the legislation to renew emergency employment today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, when Lyndon Baines Johnson came before this House and this nation to say that the United States, the richest country in the history of the world, should not have people living in squalor and in poverty, shouldn't have seniors eating dog food, shouldn't have poor kids living with no chance of a better life. He did what this nation really is all about. He really lived up to the true meaning of liberty and justice for all, and he made those words real when for so many years they had not been real. And yet, those programs which lifted millions of Americans out of poverty, that war on poverty which lifted so many out and gave so many people a chance, after about 10 years there became a war on poverty. Now the latest battle in the war on poverty, what took place on December 28, 2013, when this House refused to extend unemployment insurance for 1.3 million Americans. This is no way to uphold the great legacy of the war on poverty. Let's pass unemployment insurance. Let's do it now.
The chair lays before the House the following personal requests.
Leaves of absence requested for Mr. Farr of California for today, Ms. Gabbard of Hawaii for January 8th through January 16th, and Mr. Rush of Illinois for Tuesday, January 7th, and the balance of the week.
Without objection, the requests are granted. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3, 2013, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lee, is recognized for 60 minutes as a designee of the Minority Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise today with many members to mark President Lyndon Baines Johnson's 1964 State of the Union Address. Let me first take a moment to thank Leader Pelosi, our Whip Steny Hoyer, and the Chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, Congresswoman Marcia Fudge, for their tremendous leadership in leading our agenda for economic justice and for jobs. This is truly an historic day in our fight to provide every American with a pathway out of poverty. This morning we were joined here at the Capitol by Lyndon Johnson Robb, President Lyndon Baines Johnson, and Lady Bird Johnson's eldest daughter, to mark the 50th anniversary of her father's State of the Union speech in which he declared an unconditional war on poverty. At the time of his speech, the nation's supplemental poverty rate was approximately 26%. 36% of low-income households struggled with food insecurity, and more than a third of American seniors were living in poverty. And let me tell you, President Johnson got it. He recognized in his speech that poverty is a national problem requiring national organization and support. He knew that in a great society, it is absolutely essential that we prioritize investments that lift millions out of poverty. As a result of his vision, his daughter reminded us this morning of the bipartisan and bicameral effort that followed. Benchmark anti-poverty legislation passed during the Johnson administration, including, and I want to remind everyone of these major initiatives that have significantly changed the lives of millions of Americans: the Civil Rights Act, the Urban Mass Transportation Act, the Criminal Justice Act, the Food Stamp Act, the Older Americans Act, Social Security Amendments, the Voting Rights Act, the Housing and Urban Development Act, the Public Works and Economic Development Act, the Department of Housing and Urban Development Act, the amendment to the Immigration and Nationality Act, the Higher Education Act, the Child Nutrition Act, the Child Protection Act, and the National School Lunch Act, in addition to Head Start, Job Corps, of course food stamps, now known as SNAP, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. The result of these policies and programs are undeniable. The poverty rate was cut nearly in half by the mid-1970s. They even had a personal impact on many of us here, a personal impact on me, providing a critical bridge over troubled water when I was a single mother in the 70s, trying to raise 2 boys and go to college. And I'm forever grateful to the American people for being there for me when I needed them. And we know that today, 50 years later, these critical anti-poverty programs continue to provide that support for vulnerable Americans and people living on the edge. Today, the nation's supplemental poverty rate is now 16%, well below what it was in 1964. The programs put in place after the war on poverty, they work. They create economic security, return people to their dignity, and provide opportunities for Americans to lift themselves out of poverty. According to a report released by the Center for American Progress yesterday, without the safety net initiated as a part of the war on poverty, poverty rates today would be nearly double what they currently are. I'd like to request unanimous consent, Mr. Speaker, to insert this report into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Let me give you an example. SNAP lifted 5 million people out of poverty in 2012 alone, and according to a new report by the White House released yesterday, unemployment benefits reduced poverty by nearly 1% in 2012 alone. Without Social Security, nearly half of our nation's seniors would live in poverty. And since 2008, unemployment insurance has kept 11 million people out of poverty, including 2.5 million children and adults in 2012. We're going to talk about not only the history this evening, but the challenges ahead. And I would like now to ask Congresswoman, to yield to Congresswoman Yvette Clarke from New York to speak about many of the challenges which remain, in addition to a historical perspective on the war on poverty. Thank you again.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. thank the gentlelady for yielding. Mr. Speaker, 5 decades after President Johnson declared a war on poverty, economic inequality is pervasive in our society, and our work to reduce substantial disparities in income and wealth must continue. But we must not forget that the war on poverty has and will continue to improve the lives of millions of Americans. For who among us would tell a senior citizen that Medicare was a failure? Or tell the parents of a child who attends preschool under Head Start that that program doesn't work? Who among us would tell families who had access to desperately needed and often life-saving health care as a result of Medicaid that that program was not worth the cost? Mr. Speaker, our work has not yet been completed. In December, we returned home to share the holiday season with our families, to gather at the dinner table, and to exchange gifts. However, millions of Americans were not as fortunate because Congress returned home without extending unemployment benefits to 1.3 million Americans, not including the millions of people who rely on them and their families. If unemployment benefits are not extended, approximately 5 million Americans are expected to lose emergency unemployment benefits over the next 12 months, and of that number, 383,000 are New Yorkers. Additionally, the lapse of unemployment benefits is likely to result in an increase in demand for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program known as SNAP. This is occurring at a time when the Republicans are contemplating making $40 billion in cuts to nutrition assistance. Already, 3,185,000 New Yorkers are dealing with the impacts of a SNAP benefit cut that happened this past November due to an expiration of funding made available under the American Recovery Act. This is unfair. This is unjust. It makes no sense, and more importantly, it does not help Americans regain their economic footing. But we have the ability to correct this mistake by extending unemployment benefits and preventing further cuts to SNAP. Congress can affirm the common priorities that we share as a nation and work together to make them a reality. We as a Congress must continue to work together to end poverty in America. And having said that, I yield back to the gentlelady, and in remembrance of President Johnson's 50 years war on poverty, we need to take up the battle once again.
Thank you. Let me now yield to the gentleman from North Carolina, Congressman G.K. Butterfield.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding time, and thank you very much, Ms. Lee, for your passion and your extraordinary work on the issue of poverty and related causes. Thank you so much. Mr. Speaker, 50 years ago, President Lyndon B. Johnson made a very bold pronouncement. He declared a national war on poverty. President Johnson helped pave the way for so many low-income families, and I am proud today to recognize his immeasurable contributions to the battle against poverty. I understand that President Johnson's daughter is still on Capitol Hill. She visited with the Congressional Black Caucus today, and I just want to publicly thank her and thank the Johnson family for their contribution to America. Just last year, we commemorated the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington and Dr. Martin Luther King's historic speech imploring all Americans to aspire towards a society of equality and acceptance. Dr. King's speech illustrated the racial realities faced by people of color since before even the Civil War. In 1964, President Johnson delivered a historic State of the Union address right in this chamber that exposed the tough racial inequalities present in the 1960s. He gave voice to the poor by contrasting the stark economic differences between the wealthy and the poor, and inspired a series of transformative laws, including the Civil Rights Act and the Economic Opportunity Act. Those laws, Mr. Speaker, established the first federal framework to combat the racial and economic and educational and even employment inequities that were pervasive in our society. The landmark legislation enacted during the Johnson administration built upon the principles of the Declaration of Independence, the Emancipation Proclamation, New Deal, and the Civil Rights Movement. The work begun by President Johnson more than a half a century ago continues today with no less urgency. While national poverty metrics have improved since the war on poverty began, income inequality is still a major problem today, and pockets of persistent poverty remain all across our country. In my congressional district, 1 in 4 people that I represent, including 36% of our children, live at or below the poverty level. Income inequality in America is getting worse. I want to say that again for emphasis. Income inequality in America is getting worse, not better, and the gap between the haves and the have-nots continues to widen. The poverty rate now is the highest it has been since 1994, and in some parts of my district, median household incomes have dropped since the year 2000. This is a fitting week to recognize the anniversary of the war on poverty as the Senate considers extending the emergency unemployment insurance for 3 months or more. More than 170,000 unemployed North Carolinians are considered long-term unemployed and have been searching for work for more than 26 weeks. Last year, North Carolina Governor Pat McCrory dealt a devastating blow to the long-term unemployed by reducing state unemployment benefits, which caused the federal emergency unemployment compensation program to dissolve in our state. The governor made this decision knowing its harmful impacts, making North Carolina the only state in the country to end emergency jobless benefits for its citizens. That decision forfeited $780 million in urgently needed federal benefits for long-term unemployed North Carolinians and cost our state $1.5 billion in economic activity. We must stand up against those like Governor McCrory who seek to disenfranchise the less fortunate by continuing President Johnson's work by extending emergency unemployment insurance and other critical programs that help families through difficult times. We cannot afford to turn a blind eye to those who are most in need. We are not that type of country. Again, Ms. Lee, thank you for your passion. Thank you for yielding time. At this time, I will yield back.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to yield to our Democratic Whip, Steny Hoyer, who's Democratic Whip's Task Force on Poverty, Income Inequality, and Opportunity. I am honored and proud to chair, and thank you very much for being here and for your tremendous leadership.
I thank the gentlelady for taking this time. I thank the gentlelady even more for taking the time and the focus and being indefatigable in making sure that the richest nation on the face of the earth focuses on the least of these in our country. I thank her for her leadership. I'm proud that she is working on the task force on poverty, income, inequality, and opportunity, and chairing that effort for our caucus. She is doing an extraordinary job. It is time, however, that all of us continue to do an extraordinary job. When President Johnson stood in this chamber at that rostrum, Mr. Speaker, on January 8, 1964, he declared an unconditional war on poverty in America. That's been said so many times today. He launched a legislative agenda that led to the creation of Medicare, Medicaid, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and nutrition assistance for those at risk of going hungry, particularly our children. Today, thanks to that war on poverty, infant mortality has substantially decreased, childhood malnutrition has fallen significantly, and college graduations have risen. But that is not to declare victory. There is much yet to be done. The poverty rate for senior citizens in 1959 was 35%. Today, it is 9%, thanks to the New Deal and Great Society programs. Food stamps continue to keep as many as 4 million Americans out of poverty, which is why it's so critical to provide robust SNAP funding in the Farm Bill, Mr. Speaker. 50 years, a half a century after President Johnson launched the war on poverty, as we take stock of the progress we have made, we must be candid in assessing the difficult challenges that remain before us. That is what Congresswoman Lee is bringing to our attention and to the attention of the country. Following the Great Recession, and with long-term unemployment higher than it was a few years ago, millions of our fellow Americans are today teetering on the edge of poverty, while others still have yet to escape its grasp. In 2012, according to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, nearly 50 million people in America were poor in the richest land on the face of the earth, and more than 1 in 5 of those were children. States and local governments, under pressure from reductions in federal funding for domestic programs, are struggling to maintain the safety net that for a generation has placed a floor under those who have lost a job, fallen ill, or born into dire circumstances. As middle-class families have strained under the difficult conditions of the recession and its consequences, the lowest-income Americans have been forced to endure a severe lack of opportunities to enter the middle class. We want to promote jobs. We want to make sure the middle class can succeed, support themselves and their families, and have the kind of life that we dream of and promise as an American. But we also want to make sure that those who are not middle class can get into the middle class. In his State of the Union address in 1964, President Johnson said this, and I quote, "Very often, a lack of jobs and money is not the cause of poverty, but the symptom. The cause may lie deeper in our failure to give our fellow citizens a fair chance to develop their own capacities, in a lack of education and training, in a lack of medical care and housing, in a lack of decent communities in which to live and bring up their children. Poverty is the result, not the cause. Central to our ability to sustain the American dream is our responsibility to one another to make upward mobility possible. Right now, 1.4 million Americans, right now, Mr. Speaker, are worrying about meeting their basic needs since emergency unemployment insurance was cut off on December 28th of last year, 3 days after Christmas, the season of giving, the season of caring, the season of thinking about those who were in need. Every week that goes by without turning this lifeline back on, we'll see another 72,000 Americans lose their emergency income. Congress has the ability to restore these benefits right now. And Democrats, proud of our history leading the war on poverty, will continue to push and demand for that extension. Democrats will keep fighting for a strong, secure, and growing middle class by working to raise the minimum wage. And I see my friend from Maryland, Mr. Delaney, in the back of the chamber. Congressman Delaney has been leading an effort in our state to make sure that we raise the minimum wage. Making sure the Affordable Care Act expands access to quality health care as intended. We must also create a pathway to citizenship and opportunities for undocumented workers who are living in the shadows in poverty as part of a comprehensive immigration reform. And we must be vigorous in enforcing our laws that prevent discrimination in housing, hiring, and access to education. Mr. Speaker, if we are to make serious progress in the war on poverty in the years to come, it will have to be as a result of both parties working together to prioritize economic opportunity and upward mobility. And Mr. Speaker, I will say that there are Republican leaders, and I applaud them for it, who are talking about and focusing on those in poverty, those who have little in our country. I applaud them for talking, but talk is not enough. We must invest in making sure that they can avail themselves of the promise of America, not by telling the most vulnerable Americans that they'll have to fend for themselves, that their fellow citizens will not lend a helping hand during the time of need. I'm glad, Mr. Speaker, that President Obama has chosen to make reducing economic inequality a focus in 2014. This, Mr. Speaker, ought to be our sacred charge, to carry on the work that President Johnson and others began without pause until hunger, homelessness, and economic insecurity in any form no longer endanger the promise of our nation. And I thank the gentlelady for her leadership and for yielding. And I yield back the balance of my time to her.
Thank you very much for that very powerful message, Mr. Hoyer. Let me now yield to Representative Danny Davis from Illinois, who continues to remind us of the formerly incarcerated individuals who have families and children living below the poverty line.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly want to thank the outstanding gentlewoman from California for yielding. And I'm pleased to join with my colleagues to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the War on Poverty, declared by President Lyndon Johnson a historic moment in our nation's history when he affirmed a national priority to support those in need. One of the reasons that I got involved and ran for public office was because of the War on Poverty and the programs it created. The War on Poverty called for citizen involvement and participation to strengthen America. As I got more involved and more engaged, the more aware I became of the difficulties faced by individuals, families, and communities. Ultimately, I decided I would run for public office. The War on Poverty has improved the lives of millions of low-income Americans through the creation of critical safety net programs, such as the ESEA Act assistance, Medicare, Medicaid, increased Social Security benefits, Head Start and legal assistance, investment in K-12 education, federal college aid and loans, a permanent food stamp program, expanded housing assistance for low-income people, community health centers, mental health programs, and we could go on and on to talk about the programs. But the real reality is that we still have not fulfilled the dream of seriously reducing and eradicating poverty. So we must not only remember, we must not only talk, but we must act. And one of the best ways to start is to provide right now, resources for individuals who are unemployed. I thank the gentlewoman and yield back.
California, Congresswoman Susan Davis, who I served with in the California legislature, who continues to remind us that middle-income individuals are worried at this point now falling into the ranks of the poor. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. And Mr. Speaker, I certainly want to thank my colleague, Congressman Lee, for this opportunity and for really the privilege of working with her for so many years. Today, the 50th anniversary of the War on Poverty reminds us all that more work must be done. And if I could relate on a personal level, I don't believe that I would have had an opportunity to continue my education without having been about to further that at the time of the War on Poverty. As someone who wanted to go into social work, it certainly was an opportunity for me to do that and to make a difference in that area. You know, one of the most important steps that we can take is to make pre-K available to all American children. Today, only 69% of American 4-year-olds are enrolled in early childhood education programs. Only 69%. You might be, surprised to learn that that troubling statistic places us near the bottom in terms of access among our advanced country OECD peers, in the bottom. In our global economy, that means that many American children start behind least when they can afford to. They just cannot make it beyond that. The stakes to address this issue today have never been higher. Over the last decade, we've learned that early childhood education makes a big difference. We've learned that the achievement gap begins before our kids even reach kindergarten. And we've learned that quality pre-K leads to better life outcomes in school, in careers, and in personal health. The research indeed shows that children who attend preschool are more likely to graduate high school, earn higher pay, and live more productive lives. And sadly, we're just not putting these lessons of the war on poverty when we began to address these issues. We're not putting these lessons into action. The argument for universal pre-K is not just a lofty moral imperative. That sounds good. No, it is good science, and it is good economics. By some estimates, the return on investment is nearly 7 to 1. And that's why most economists agree that pre-K is a great investment. It is not just another expense. I know that parents throughout San Diego and across our country just want their kids the very best start in life. And we should be working together to make that happen, to make sure all our kids get a real chance to succeed. And that, Mr. Speaker, would be one gigantic step to elevate our children out of poverty.
Thank you very much for your leadership and for being here with us tonight, Congresswoman Davis. I would like now to yield to the gentleman from New York, someone who has been a fighter and a warrior for many, many years and who continues to remind us of our moral obligation, our religious obligation for many to ensure that we continue this fight in the war on poverty. Mr. Rangel.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'd like to advise you.
Sure.
Let me first thank the gentle lady from California for carrying this torch during a time that it seems to be such a lack of sensitivity to the poor. As with Lyndon Johnson, there was a concentration of those people who vote. That's the middle class. And somehow, even now, 50 years later, we hear a lot of concerns, and rightly so, about the middle class, but somehow the poor have just been written off. And the gentle lady from California and our minority leader together have reminded us that we have a basic obligation here, that if you want to take care of the country and our spiritual needs, the poor cannot be excluded. And so in listening more recently to the words that President Johnson spoke in the joint session in 1964, it was really an act of courage to talk about something that too many people seem to be embarrassed about. And the fact is that we had a national obligation to take care of the lesser of our brothers and sisters. And today we can take for granted Medicaid, Medicare, the expansion of Social Security, incentives for our children, and earned income tax credits. All of it was done not as blacks and whites or North and Southerners or Democrats and Republicans, but with a spirit that that was a part of the reason that we were sent to Congress, to make this a stronger nation. And how moved so many people in the world was to hear the breath of fresh air coming from Rome and from the Pope, not a message to Catholics, but a message to the world, in pointing out that we have a responsibility to God to thank him or her for what has been given to us, but more importantly, to follow those biblical guidelines to say that we have an obligation to think in terms of the less of our brothers and sisters. And so whether we're seeking water or clothes or fear from prisons or assistance during times of health, it seems to me that we have this political and we have this spiritual need. But finally, I'd like to say to the gentle lady and those listening, I think from a patriot point of view and from an economist point of view and from a national security point of view, that this nation cannot survive with expansion of the poor, the delusion of the poverty of the middle class still being with them, and the wealthy just accumulating wealth by standing by doing nothing. What made this country great are not the rich and the poor, but those people that could hope to achieve for their children through education, through hard work, to achieve anything that is possible for humankind to do. And this is what built that nation. And today it is frightening as we see the disparity between the very poor and the very wealthy, to see that even talks about it would have presidents and members of Congress to be called socialists, indeed even the Pope. But the fact remains that unless we have people that have the ability to purchase, unless we have small businesses that are responsible for most all of the jobs in this country, unless we have people manufacturing and providing goods and services, then we don't have an economy. And so no matter which way you look at it from a political or an economic point of view, that if our nation is not going to succeed in terms of economic security, it can no longer be concerned with its national security and the leadership position that we hold in the world. So let me thank the gentlelady for constantly reminding us that this isn't a one-day job that we have to do. This isn't a Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Democrat-Republican issue. It's something that the world is watching what we do with our own and hoping that once we get our act together, perhaps we can do more for the world. I yield back the balance of my time.
I want to thank the gentleman for reminding us tonight of our moral obligation to the most vulnerable in our country. Thank you for being here. How much time do I have remaining, Mr. Speaker?
Gentlelady has 27 minutes.
Thank you very much. Let me yield now to the gentlelady from Connecticut, Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro, whose subcommittee I serve on Appropriations, Labor, Health, Human Services, who continues to remind us of our... Do you want to go next? Oh, okay, excuse me. Let me ask Representative Duckworth to come forward from Illinois, who will now speak on behalf not only of her constituents but the entire country. She has come to Congress, hit the ground running, and continues to remind us of our veterans and the sacrifices that they have made and to ensure their economic security. So many live on food stamps, unfortunately, as we speak. So thank you for being here.
I thank the gentlelady. Mr. Speaker, Lynn Richards of Elgin, Illinois, a town in Illinois that is well known for manufacturing everything from Elgin watches all the way through to the Elgin street sweeper still in use today. Lynn Richards of Elgin, Illinois needs her unemployment insurance extended. In April, she lost her manufacturing job of 3 years. She and her husband kept their family afloat with the help of unemployment insurance. And now, 10 months later, she is pregnant with her second child. As she said recently, I've been working since I was 20 years old. I've never had this much trouble getting a job in my life. I've applied to 200 places, and I've gotten less than 10 calls and just a couple of interviews. No employer wants to hire someone who is pregnant. Lynn is just one of 80,000 Illinoisans who have lost their unemployment insurance. I understand what these families are facing. When I was a teenager, my father, a combat veteran, was in his mid-50s and had worked since he enlisted in the Marine Corps at 16. He lost his job. My dad did everything he could to find work, but was turned down again and again. My mother took in sewing, and I took a minimum wage job to help make ends meet. Eventually, my dad got a job, but federal assistance programs were there to help keep my family afloat. Many Americans want to find work but simply cannot. Punishing these families by taking away unemployment benefits is a terrible mistake. The absence of unemployment insurance is jeopardizing the economic progress that we are making. By removing the benefits to 80,000 Illinois families, we are taking more than 25 million out of our economy every week. Let's put partisanship aside and extend unemployment insurance now for our families and our businesses. I thank the gentlelady from California again for her leadership on this issue, and I yield back.
Thank you. Now I'll yield to the gentlelady from Connecticut, Congresswoman DeLauro.
I thank the gentlelady for her leadership and her indefatigable pursuit of this cause and the focus of not just this caucus but of the country on the issue of poverty and of the poor. 50 years ago today, President Lyndon Johnson stood right behind where I stand now, urged the Congress to join him in working to end poverty in the United States. He said to this body, and I quote, "We have in 1964 a unique opportunity and an obligation to prove the success of our system, to disprove those cynics and critics at home and abroad who question our purpose and our competence. If we fail, if we fritter and fumble away our opportunity in needless, senseless quarrels between Democrats and Republicans, or between House and Senate, or between Congress and the administration, then history will judge us harshly. But if we succeed, if we can achieve these goals by forging in this country a greater sense of union, then and only then can we take full satisfaction in the State of the Union." That opportunity and obligation to prove we can work together, to do everything we can to end poverty in America, remains with us in 2014. And right now, we are failing that solemn obligation to the American people. For decades, slowly but surely, our efforts in fighting poverty have been making a difference. If you include the social safety net that President Johnson and later generations helped to construct, the poverty rate fell from 26% in 1967 to 16% in 2012. This was achieved because in the past, we have always worked to ensure that a rising tide lifts all boats, that the gains of prosperity are felt broadly, and that in tough times, Americans who fall behind have a chance to get back on their feet. But recently we have seen this House majority choose to break this long-standing compact, to turn their back on the most vulnerable Americans. Consider what they are trying to do to food stamps, our most important anti-hunger program. Food stamps helps to feed over 47 million Americans, nearly half of whom are children. For decades, Republicans and Democrats have worked together to pass a farm bill that does right by struggling Americans, even while working to support our farmers. But even though 99% of food stamp recipients live below the poverty line, this majority severed food stamps from the Farm Bill. They tried to cut food stamps by $40 billion, meaning 4 million Americans would be denied food. Even the final conference bill will reportedly cut roughly $8.5 billion from the program, deny critical food aid to over 800,000 households. And cutting this aid means kids can no longer concentrate in school because they are quite literally starving. It means seniors getting sick and going to the hospital because they can no longer afford proper nourishment. Take another example. Look what's happening with unemployment insurance. In the past, as far back as the Eisenhower administration, Congress worked together to extend unemployment benefits when the jobless rate was in the 5 to 7% range. Last month, even though unemployment remains above 7%, this House majority refused to work to extend these important benefits. The benefits have expired. What that means is that 1.3 million American men and women have already lost their unemployment insurance, including 26,000 in my state of Connecticut. Many are people who had jobs. They lost them through no fault of their own, and who in this difficult economy, and even despite education, training, and job experience, still cannot find a job. Even as the stock market is at record levels, we are telling these Americans, you are on your own. We are pulling up the ladder on them and closing the hatch. It's wrong. It's not what America is about. Slashing these programs will hurt and deny our economic recovery. Our top priority in this Congress should be do everything that we can to create jobs, help workers, help families get back on their feet. That's the moral responsibility of good government. In the words of Pope Francis, we should all be, and I quote, working to eliminate the structural causes of poverty, to promote the integral development of the poor. This means education, access to health care, and above all, employment. That is the great and the still unfinished cause that Lyndon Johnson dedicated us to 50 years ago. This nation is watching. It is time for all of us to step up, work together, and to do the right thing. Thank you, and again I thank the gentlelady for your focus on this critical issue.
Thank you so much. Thank you for not only talking the talk, but walking the walk each and every day. Let me ask now Congressman Delaney from Maryland to come forward, and thank you so much for your tremendous leadership and for being here with us tonight.
I want to thank the gentlelady for giving me